Hello, Allentown School District 4th graders. Welcome back to the Liberty Bell Museum. In our last video, I started talking about a very important period in American history, the American Revolution. That is the war that America fought to become the United States of America instead of 13 separate colonies under the control of a country called Great Britain. That's England. Now, the King of England and his government, Parliament, had very, very strict laws regarding their colonies. Now, the American colonies would send materials like wood and cotton and wool to Great Britain, where they had a lot of big factories. They would turn the wood into furniture and the materials into cloth and send them back to the colonies and charge a lot of money for them. There were taxes that the colonists had to pay, and there were laws about you had to host British soldiers in your house if they wanted to stay there. And basically the laws weren't fair to the colonists, but they had no say in it. They had no say in how their tax money was spent, and they had no say in the laws that governed them. That was called taxation without representation. And as the rules got more and more unfair, more people in the colonies thought that they'd be better off as their own country instead of answering to Great Britain. So all of the colonies sent representatives to a Congress in Philadelphia. Now, it was very much like the Congress we have today. There were representatives from all the colonies, and their big debate was whether or not America should be independent, its own country and free. So one of the members of Congress, Thomas Jefferson, he wrote a declaration, which is a very strong statement. The Congress declared that the 13 American colonies should be one country separate from England. So they were declaring their independence. So what was that document called? If you think it was the Declaration of Independence, you're right, it was. Now, since there was no radio or TV back then, news got around very, very slowly. The Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4th, 1776. King George, the ruler of England, 4,000 miles away on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, he didn't hear about it for 6 weeks, until the middle of August, because in order for him to get the message, someone had to take a copy of the Declaration, get on a ship in Philadelphia, sail 4,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean, which took 4 or 5 weeks on a fast ship. A slow ship could take 2 or 3 months. And then when they got to England, they had to ride to London to find the king and give him the Declaration. When the king saw this declaration, he was not happy. Where he saw a declaration of war instead of independence. So he sent his soldiers to America to put down the rebellion. Now, the British Army in 1777 was considered the best army in the whole world. They were the best trained, they were the best shots. They were just considered the best army. And they had the coolest uniforms. Their coats were a very distinctive color, and you could see them coming from miles away. So, what color were their coats? Were they the pink coats? Raise your hand if you think they were the pink coats. Were they the green coats? Raise your hand if you think they were. Were they the red coats? If you have your hand raised, you're right. They were the red coats. And yes, you could see them coming from miles away, but they were the best army in the world, so that didn't really matter. They usually won. And in 1777, yes, the British Army was winning against the American rebels. And the British sent 18,000 soldiers sailing up the Chesapeake Bay and the Susquehanna River, 50 miles west of Philadelphia. There, 18,000 soldiers got out and marched toward the city in September of 1777. George Washington and his troops held them off away from the city for about 2 days before the British Army broke through their line and marched towards Philadelphia. Now, the British had announced that they were going to take all of the big bells in Philadelphia and melt them down and turn them into cannons. Now, the British didn't need more cannons. What they were doing was shutting the bells up so the colonists could not communicate with each other. That's why you need a bell you can hear 20 to 40 miles away, so you can send messages. Now, the colonists worked out codes, and the codes were basically how many times you rang a bell in 5 or 10 minutes, and how fast and how slow, and in combinations. So if you were listening for that code, you would get the message. So the British wanted that stopped so the colonists couldn't talk to each other. So the colonists decided they would rather lose their bells for a little while than forever, so they decided to get the bells out of the city. Now, George Washington had ordered a troop from North Carolina, the 4th North Carolina, that was about 200 soldiers and their commanding officer. They were taking wounded soldiers and medical supplies to the Continental Army's new hospital in Bethlehem, which is 5 miles east of here. And when the citizens of Philadelphia saw that there were soldiers going north, they decided to go with them to get out of the city before the British arrived. So they took with them things that they did not want the British Army to get, including the 11 biggest bells in the city. That's how many bells were hidden here, 11. The big bell and 10 smaller bells from 2 churches. The other 10 bells were all different sizes, but none of them were as big as the Pennsylvania State House bell. That's what they called it back then. It wasn't called the Liberty Bell quite yet. And they brought the bells 60 miles north, here to Northampton Town. But they stopped in Bethlehem first to deliver the wounded soldiers and the medical supplies. And it was there that the wagon carrying the Liberty Bell had a little accident. The wagon was being driven by a local farmer named John Jacob Mickley. He had been in Philadelphia to sell his produce, and he had an empty wagon when he was done, and so did several other farmers. Now, it wasn't unusual for a farmer to buy a ton of hay to feed his cows and horses. So if a farmer was hauling hay, nobody was going to look twice at a wagon full of hay. And nobody could see what was underneath all of the hay. That is how the bells came from Philadelphia to Northampton Town. Now, why do I keep calling Allentown Northampton Town? That's because William Allen, the man who founded this town, named it Northampton Town. It was everybody else who insisted on calling it Mr. Allen's Town. That didn't become official until much later. So for now, in 1777, the bells were coming to Northampton Town, to Zion's Church, which is where the museum is. Now, Zion's Church looked a little different than it does now. As a matter of fact, this is what Zion's Church looked like in 1777. It's made out of stone. And there is a space at the very bottom of the church between the floor of the church and the ground where there was room for the bells to be hidden in this space. And that is where they hid the bells. Now, how did they get the bells down under the floor? They had devices. They used poles and ropes and pulleys and strong farmers pulling on the ropes to raise and lower the bell. That's how they got the bells down under the floor into the hole. And that is how they got the bell off of one wagon and onto another in Bethlehem. Because the driver who was driving the wagon with the Pennsylvania State House bell, John Jacob Mickley, had a little accident coming into Philadelphia, coming into Bethlehem. his rear axle broke and one of his wheels shattered, so he couldn't bring the bell any farther than Bethlehem. So they needed to put his bell on another wagon. So they tied ropes to the bell and ran it over a pulley. This makes lifting heavy things much easier. You put your ropes through here, you tie it to an object, then you pull on the rope and lift the object. That is how they got the bell out of Mr. Mickley's wagon and put it on the wagon of another local farmer named Frederick Leeser. Mr. Leeser brought it the last 5 miles from Bethlehem. So both Mr. Mickley and Mr. Leeser get credit. The bells came here on September 24th, 1777. They were here for 9 months. The winter that George Washington was at Valley Forge with his troops, the bells were here under the floorboards of Zion's Church where nobody could find them. And because they weren't captured by the British, they were never melted down. So the Liberty Bell survived to become the Liberty Bell. Now, I have saved the most important question for last. This is the question that everybody asks about the bell. How did it get that great big crack in it? And the answer is, nobody knows for sure. Everybody has theories, and there are a lot of stories about how the bell got its crack. It was dropped. It fell out of the wagon. It fell out of the bell tower. It was rung too many times. But no one knows for sure because there is no one thing that says this is exactly how the bell cracked. So we have to just tell stories about it and use your imaginations. Now, before we end, we're going to get in a very, very quick science lesson. I'm going to ring the bell again, and this time from a scientific aspect. The reason you can hear the bell is because of sound waves. Sound waves travel, and when they hit your ears, you hear the sound they're carrying. Now you can hear the bell, right? Put your hands on your throat like this, because the bell is doing exactly what you do when you talk. Right. Now with your hands on your throat like this, say Liberty Bell. Do it again. Liberty Bell. Do you feel that buzzing under your hand? That is exactly what the bell is doing. Now, one more time, put your hands on your throat and say, "Let freedom ring." I hope that you have enjoyed your tour of the Liberty Bell Museum, and I hope someday you can come in person and touch the bell. But until then, thank you very much for watching our video. Enjoy the rest of your day.